So from a very young age, I wanted to be a veterinarian. I loved animals and I wanted to help them, Thought I was going to go to school for many years, go to veterinary school, and help sick dogs and cats. Now you're not here tonight to hear about the puppy that I saved, so obviously something changed. Sometime around second grade, I decided I wanted to be an architect. In GT class, we learned about architecture and architects, specifically Frank Lloyd Wright. Thought he was the coolest dude ever. He built all these awesome houses, and he wasn't a great person, but his job sounded really cool, so I wanted to be an architect. Now you're also not here tonight to hear about the house that I designed, so something changed after that too. I think the biggest change really occurred when I started to do these hands-on projects, specifically the Pinewood Derby through my church. I built really cool looking things that didn't go very fast. Among them, my famous Yellow Submarine. It was obviously inspired by the Beatles song, a small car about this big that had a perfect submarine shape with a little periscope and everything. But the biggest feature was that on the inside it had a recording device. When I hit this little button on the side, it would play the Beatles hit, "We All Live in a Yellow Submarine." It's very cool. I won awards at the state level, and at that point I kind of thought, hey, I like hands-on building and creation, and so that was really the first car that I built. From there things kind of ramped up, and obviously they've gotten a little bit bigger. In middle school, I realized that I liked math and science, and I was actually pretty good at it. I joined the math and science team, and I actually went to state for science, so I started to think, maybe architecture isn't what I want to do. Maybe it's engineering. And I think that was really confirmed for me in 8th grade, the 8th grade science fair. I built a biodiesel go-kart. Now it wasn't just biodiesel, and it wasn't just a go-kart. It was actually a multi-power source, so I could run biodiesel, regular diesel, or traditional gasoline. Now this involves swapping out motors and having multiple different engines, and obviously that complicates the geometry of the project, so I designed this go-kart from scratch and welded it myself from angle iron. And with my design, I was able to lift one engine in and put it on and bolt it in 4 bolts and have a completely different power source. This was really cool to me. The opportunity to create something that was somewhat practical. I could drive it down the street and enjoy it and have fun. And I was actually pretty successful with it. I won our school science fair and then went on to a regional science fair where I was recognized for engineering such an awesome project. In high school, going in, I kind of knew that I wanted to do engineering, but I didn't really know what type. In 10th grade, I took a course at Arcade Center called Introduction to Engineering Design. Well, it was very cool. It was a great experience. I learned a lot about CAD and design and kind of the principles of designing engineering projects. And I really liked the class, but it wasn't really hands-on. There wasn't any physical product created from that. So I wanted something where I would have the opportunity to learn experientially, which kind of brings us to ISM. Now, going into ISM, I had to have a specific topic. So I look back at my experience with projects and creation and design and my skills with math and science, and I kind of looked into it, I researched, and I decided that mechanical engineering was the best topic for me. And this was really confirmed for me when we took a trip down to UT for engineering open house night and saw the UT Mechanical Engineering School's endurance car team. Now a lot of schools have these teams that build cars. They look like little formula cars, and they are part of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers outreach program for colleges. They build these cars and they compete, and it's really a competition of engineering. And that was just really cool to me. I thought, this is something I'd want to do in college and maybe before. So mechanical engineering kind of stuck on me then. So going into ISM, I knew that that's what I wanted to do, and I communicated that to Mr. Wysong, and obviously he bought it because here I am. Now, some of you might not know what ISM is. You probably do if you're here, but for those who don't, ISM is Independent Study and Mentorship. There's a program here in Frisco and now some of the surrounding districts where students come in with a topic that they'd like to learn more about. Obviously for me it was mechanical engineering, and they apply for this program where it's completely free. You get to explore your topic and learn more about it and whether it's something that you'd actually want to do. And you work with a mentor and someone in the field to learn about what they do and whether or not that's something that you would want to do. Now, you don't get to just sign up. There's an application process. You have to fill out this long application with short answers and things about yourself and a little essay. And there's teacher recommendations. All 8 of your teachers have to review you, and Mr. Wysong gets plenty of feedback about you from them, so he knows what he's getting. And then there's an interview, face-to-face, one-on-one with Mr. Wysong, where you have to prove to him that you are passionate about your field. So once you're into the program, you start off kind of slow with lessons on professionalism and presenting yourself and being marketable. So for the first 6 weeks or so, we learned about building resumes and networking and interviewing and things like that. So once we were ready, we could go out and interview with professionals. Now, before we did any of that, we had to do our own independent research. Now, there aren't any kind of guidelines for this research. It's just kind of find something that interests you and then go talk about it or learn about it. So my first topic was 3D printing. I read a couple of different articles about what was happening in the space and different possibilities for the future, and I thought, this is really cool. So I wrote my report about kind of what I learned and then what I thought about the different possibilities for the future and how 3D printing opens up global manufacturing on a minute-by-minute basis, what you need, when you need it, and I thought that was really cool. I also researched STEM education, something that is obviously relevant to me as I go forward and pursue engineering. I learned about the different ways and approaches to education in STEM, and that was something that I found really interesting and something I've actually talked a lot about with my mentor, Dr. Junaid, and we've discussed, and still something that really interests me. So I also learned about self-driving cars and electric vehicles. I researched this team at Stanford University that has taken a DeLorean, like from Back to the Future, and they stripped it all the way down and rebuilt it as an electric car with all kinds of self-driving technology. And this car doesn't just drive on streets or walk around or drive around the obstacle course. It'll do donuts and drift. So I thought that was the coolest thing. It is a high-performance, self-driving electric vehicle, and the engineering that goes into that is just incredible to have such fast response and high-fidelity sensors and everything. So that's definitely something that interested me and kind of led me in the direction of my electric car. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there is an interview component to ISM. We have to conduct at least 5 interviews with professionals in the field and learn from them and kind of feel out really who we want to work with for the rest of the year. And my very first interview was with Dr. Bruce Junaid, who, as you know, is my mentor, and he turned out to be by far my favorite person. So I asked him around January if he would be willing to be my mentor for the rest of the year, and here we are. We've had a great mentorship experience. I really appreciate all the help he's given me. Dr. Junaid is a very interesting man, probably one of the smartest people I've met. His job is kind of 3 parts, as I understand it. He is the Vice President for Research at the University of Texas at Dallas. So he oversees their $100 million research budget across all the fields and all the research that they do there. He oversees research in engineering and math and even the humanities and things like that. And he's also a professor. Dr. Junaid, as I've learned, loves teaching and helping people. So he teaches a freshman chemistry class every couple of semesters. And then the third part of his job, which is also very interesting to me, is he has his own research team. Their topic of investigation is neutron detection on a small, inexpensive scale. So he's working with a group of undergraduates and graduate students to develop devices about this big, cost about $5, that detect neutron emission from radioactive substances. Now, that all sounds a little bit threatening, and it is. The purpose of these mainly is to detect nuclear weapons were they to reach our soils. So it's very important work, very interesting, and they've made a lot of progress. They're now one of the leaders in the field with an excellent product that I've had the opportunity to see. It was very cool. And so that's kind of what Dr. Nate does. We've met once a week and kind of talked about what he does and what I'm doing with this project, and he's been incredibly helpful. I'll be honest, reading his job description, I didn't really expect him to have any specific experience with my project, but I've been amazed at everything that he knows. He's been able to help me with every problem that I've had, and I really appreciate him and all the help that he's given me. So the main event, why everyone's here tonight, we have the third component of ISM is a project, something that represents all of the learning and exploration that you've done for the year, a culmination of all of that into one representation. Now, I started thinking about this long before I was even in ISM. I kind of knew what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to do something big and cool, and wanted to draw on, my experience with biodiesel go-kart and my passion with the Pinewood Derby cars, and so kind of something automotive, but also looking forward to the future. So I thought electric. So around September, I went to Mr. Weissong and I said, I would like to build an electric car for my project. And I've been so thankful. He's been incredibly supportive this whole way. He said, that's awesome. If you can make it happen, that would be cool. Go nuts. So I originally was working on a conversion, which is where you take an existing car and basically put electric components in it so that it runs on electric power. I started with an old junker from the 1980s that I bought without an engine or transmission, mistake number one, and I decided that I was going to do a conversion and a restoration, mistake number two. As I got into the project, I was very ambitious, and I'd never restored a car before or really undertaken a project of this scale, so I thought it would be a good idea to undertake the restoration before the conversion. I decided to knock all the paint off the car, and I made a whole mess of the garage, sanding all the paint off, and I even tried sandblasting the car. And then, mistake number three, I decided it would be a good idea to pull the electrical system out of the car. Now at this point, I stepped back and I looked at the car and I realized I had about 500 hours of work to go. This wasn't really realistic for the time frame that I had for ISM this year. So I started to look at alternatives. What could I do where I still built a car, still had experience with an electric vehicle, but was more realistic for the time frame that I had? And so I started looking at purpose-built education type kits. I found this company out in California who builds a kit meant for educational settings, meant to teach engineering principles and a little bit about the basics of design and engineering, but also more in depth about electric vehicles and electric power and battery systems. And I thought this was the perfect opportunity to learn about every system involved in the vehicle, and then specifically the different electrical components. So we ordered a kit around November, and due to various delays and problems on the supply side, I didn't receive it until March. But in the meantime, I worked on my original work. Another component of ISM is designing a completely individual and unique project that explores kind of something that you're interested in, and then that you synthesize a solution for a problem. For me, the problem was that the kit I had chosen had a range of about 50 miles. Now that's great for commuting and going to school, to work, to the grocery store, but every now and then you want to go a little further. If I want to drive down in Dallas and back, I really wouldn't feel comfortable. So I looked into developing a hybridization system. Now I looked at numerous different possibilities for how to do this. I looked at parallel hybrids, series hybrids, pusher trailers, puller trailers, all kinds of fun different possibilities. I looked at turbine power and solar power and various different technologies to supply power. But ultimately, I realized that the simplest, most elegant, and easiest solution was actually to take a genset, about 1 kilowatt, um, basically what you would find at Home Depot, and disassemble that to use the components, rearrange them into a configuration that worked for me, and install them into the car. This way I had a motor and a generator, basically an alternator that produced power that I could plug directly into my already installed infrastructure for charging the car. So I designed this system, and that was kind of my original work, was finding a solution to this problem. Now, after I'd done that, shortly after, I finally got the car. This was the most exciting moment, aside from actually driving it, but it arrived on a truck after its drive here from California. It arrived around midnight on a Thursday night, and I actually couldn't be here for that. I was at school the next day, and I was at my mother's house, and it arrived here around midnight, so my dad rolled it off the car, and he sent me a text like, this thing is a lot bigger than we expected, it's a lot heavier. He struggled to get it into the garage. I thought he might have to leave it out in the street that night, but he got it in there, and I was extremely excited. I hadn't even seen it yet, and I knew that this was going to be really cool. So the next day, Friday, I went to school, and this was the day before spring break, so we weren't really doing much. We were watching Ice Princess in my physics class, AP Physics, and I decided that that wasn't really as interesting as this project that I had waiting for me in my garage. So I went to Mr. Wysong and I asked Mr. Wysong, can I check out of school? Can I go work on my project? And he said, as long as it's ISM related, go ahead. So I left school at around 9:30 on Friday, and I drove straight to my dad's house, went into the garage, and found that this kit was really just a chassis with the wheels on it so that it would roll, and then 1,000 little pieces in boxes inside the car. Every single wire, but no nut, bolt, and component was in a box, and I just tore into it, laid it all out in the driveway, and looked at the 1,000 pieces that I would have to put onto this car. And I decided I would just go head first, right into it, and I started putting things together and putting things on the car, and I shortly realized that I didn't really have all the tools that I needed. So at about noon on that Friday, I went on a big run and bought all new sets of metric tools and standard tools and a battery charger and a brake bleeder and even a wooden dowel for bending brake lines. And once I had all the tools that I needed, I went back to the house. It's probably 2 p.m. now, and I really started to get to work. Now, once I started working, I didn't actually stop until about 5 p.m. on Saturday. I worked all through the night, I didn't sleep, and I really did get a lot done. I started out with the brake lines. I had to assemble the brake system, the brake pedals, and then the brake calipers, and mount them in the front and on the individual wheels. And then I had my first experience with bending brake lines and then bleeding brake lines. Now, if you've never bent brake lines, it's really not a fun process. They're small hydraulic lines about this thin, very fragile, and I had a length of it about 5 feet long that was coiled up, and I had to somehow turn that into the shape of my car. So first I had to straighten these, which is rather precarious. I had to get a special tool for straightening brake lines, and then I had to bend them down in one plane, over in another, and then back in a third plane. So it's a very complex shape here. Fit it perfectly to the curve of the body of the car, back around the rear wheel, avoiding all the mounting hardware for the engine. Motor doesn't have an engine. And then up into the rear wheel. This probably took me about 4 hours trying to get the perfect shape for my brake lines, and it really wasn't fun. Once I did get them on, I had to bleed the brake lines. Now this car, being green and eco-friendly, doesn't use brake fluid. No, that's bad, that's corrosive, and we don't use that. It uses safflower oil, which is actually a food-grade cooking oil. So I bought big jugs of it from Whole Foods, felt very strange, and pumped it into the back wheel and all the way up through all of the brake lines into the master cylinder in the front. Now I had another problem with that. I hadn't tightened something, so oil was spraying out of the side and covering everything in the garage in safflower oil. But once I got that figured out, I got the brakes bleeded and they actually worked. So that was really the first thing that I accomplished on the car, and that was really exciting to have taken the raw materials and put it all together into a system that worked and was necessary for my car. Next, I started working on the electrical, which was almost as difficult and about as fun. I had roughly 500 wires, individual wires, that on one side went to a fuse box, and on the other side went to each individual electrical component on the car. Now, if you look at it, it looks like a fairly simple car, but as you think about it, every dash light has about 4 wires. The little controller has about 5, every light has 3. So everything really starts to add up, and all these wires have to go somewhere. So I spent basically all through the night taking each wire, tracing it to its source, plugging it in there, routing it through the car, and taking it to the fuse box and screwing it in individually. Now I had to use a jeweler screwdriver because these are tiny wires and I was doing really precise work. And by the next morning my fingers were rubbed raw with all these wires, but I finally had them all installed. That was also a huge accomplishment. It felt very cool. But even though I had all these wires installed, the lights wouldn't start. The battery was installed and charged and everything was hooked up, but nothing would start, nothing would turn on, which was fairly discouraging. You know, I spent all this time and energy installing all these wires and nothing worked. So I spent probably the next day, day and a half, tracing each individual wire back to its source and then back to the fuse box and then back out the other side to its termination point. And I put together this email that was 4 pages long, single spaced, 12-point font, and as I was getting ready to send my email, I was flipping through the instruction manual, looking at the different pictures of the electrical systems, and I realized that their fuse box didn't look anything like mine. See, what I'd been forgetting was that this is a fuse box, and I didn't have any fuses in my fuse box. Obviously, this doesn't work out very well. Their picture had all these little colorful rectangles, and mine had none. It had the spaces for them, but I didn't have any actual fuses. So once I figured that out, I went back to the wiring diagrams, I identified all the fuses I needed, I went to an AutoZone and I bought the parts, and as soon as I plugged in those fuses, the car started right up. The lights started and the brake lights worked when I pushed the pedal, and that was just amazingly gratifying, to know that all those individual wires were in the right place and they were working. And so that was really my first major hurdle with problems, was the electrical system. I may have wasted a little bit of time, checking each wire, but I felt like I really learned a lot about where each wire went and how it worked and really how an electrical system worked. And, it's really an experience that you can't get from reading about an electrical system. I think that this kind of hands-on learning really characterized this project. Something, I ran into a problem, I had to learn about the system to solve the problem, and I think that's really the benefit of this whole project. Another problem that I had after that was that while I had all the electrical installed, I didn't have the mechanical drivetrain hooked up. See, my chain shipped in a big, heavy, double-wide, heavy-duty chain that was about 3 times as long as I needed. And because it was so heavy-duty, I couldn't punch a link out and shorten it. So, like any good engineer, I turned to my power tools. And I took a cut-off saw, and I strapped this thing into a vise, and I just ground it in half, chopped right through it, and it was the right size. I cleaned it up and, made it fit together again, and then I finally had a complete drive system. This was incredibly exciting. I jacked it up and getting ready to spin the wheels for the first time. I didn't want to try to actually drive it for the first operation. And I went to drive it and it wouldn't work. The pedal wasn't doing anything. So I went back to the drawing board, back to the electrical diagrams, and luckily this time it was a fairly easy fix. I Had to reach up under the dashboard and reset the inertia switch. It has a small device that disengages the electrical system in case of an accident so that you don't have any kind of shock in the accident. Once I reset that, I was able to climb in the car, push the brake pedal, and the wheel slowly spun. That was probably the second most exciting at that point. You know, it was still up on block, so I hadn't driven it. But it wasn't quite as exciting as the arrival of the car. Now, once I got it spinning, I knew I had to take it out for a drive. Unfortunately, this was at about 2 a.m. and my dad, ever the conscious neighbor, said, "Can't really drive it at night, we'll upset the neighbors." So I went to bed that night at about 3 a.m. You know, looking forward to driving my car for the first time after all this work that I had done. And I woke up at probably 7 a.m. the next morning. I ran out to the garage and I climbed in and I got everybody up so that they could film my first trip in the car. And I slowly backed out of the garage in reverse, which thankfully worked, and went with the one labeled reverse. I didn't punch through the front of the garage. And as I drove it out of the garage, I realized I had another problem. I could barely make it out of the garage in reverse on an angle. I just wasn't getting enough power to the rear wheel. This was obviously upsetting. I thought I finally had this final product and I was ready to drive, but as I drove around the neighborhood, I could barely get it going 10 miles an hour. It would ramp up speed and power, and then it would completely die and just coast down to a start. And I'd get all the way off the brake pedal and then get all the way back on it at full throttle. It would ramp up again and then die. And there was clearly a point where it was reaching and just giving up. So this was frustrating. I spent probably the next 3 weeks talking to my mentor and the kit company and really troubleshooting every single problem that it could have been. And ultimately I'd kind of given up. I was looking at just replacing the entire throttle assembly. And so I had moved on to my next problem, which was that my high beam switch wasn't working. Now this was also a fairly simple problem. I had an idea of what it was. When I was installing all those 500 wires, I pulled a little bit too hard and pulled the wire out of its pin connector. I'd cramp it back in there and tried to crimp it shut, but obviously I wasn't getting continuity through the connector. So to check this, I pulled it out of the pin and I pulled the connector off and I touched it directly to the relay. Now, because I had been working on the problem with the power, I had the rear wheel jacked up. And it's a good thing I did, because as soon as I touched that wire to the relay, my rear wheel spun up to 100% power in a split second, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. My foot was not on the gas, I was not touching it at all, so I freaked out. I hit the big red panic button and it cut all electrical power to the car, and it slowly spun down. Luckily, no damage was done. I didn't overheat the motor or the controller or anything like that, but I was a little bit scared. This thing had just spun up like some monster with like a ghost had jumped on the gas pedal, got it going faster than I ever had, unintentionally. So I kind of stepped back and I took about 15 minutes to, get it together and realize that, I'm gonna go solve this problem. So I went back out and I was looking at all the wires and I realized that the problem was pretty simple. One of the wires from my throttle had disconnected, so it was not receiving any variable current. It was only receiving 100% power. Once I plugged that back in, I went back to my computer. The whole car is computer programmable. You plug it in with an Ethernet port and you adjust the settings. So I was playing with the settings. I was going one by one, trying to figure out what the problem was. And eventually I got to the half throttle delivery. You can adjust the point in the throttle throw at which 50% power is delivered. Now you can set as low as 10%, so that you have really high power for the other 90%. Or you can set it as low as 90%, so that you have low power for the first 90% and really high power for the last 10%. Now I had figured that I wanted more high power in that last 90%, so I had it set really low. I had it actually at 20%. So I figured I'd try the extremes. I set it to 10%, and I realized that it was more closely doing what it did on the street. Now before this, I wasn't able to really troubleshoot, because when I jacked up the rear wheel, it wouldn't do the dying problem. It would just ramp up to full power. So obviously it was a problem with resistance. Now when I set it to 10%, it more closely did the thing. It spun up and then it slowed down. So I thought, well, changing it from 20 to 10 made it worse. I'll go in the opposite extreme. I set it to 90%. And as soon as I changed that one setting and then got back on the throttle, I could tell my problem was solved. I knew I had to drive it, so I lowered the jack and took it for a spin around the neighborhood. Again, this is at midnight. I put in a lot of long hours, so I did a lot of testing late at night, and thankfully my problem was solved. I had full power. I got it up to about 45 miles per hour in the neighborhood. It wasn't licensed, so I had to go kind of slow, but I could tell it would go more, and I knew that my power problem was fixed. Now, of course, once I had that problem fixed, I ran into a new one, which was that it wouldn't charge with the charger that I was given. And I think that that's really a problem of not the charger itself, but the charger controller. There's a separate computer that activates the charging system and manages the batteries. And mine was shipped in a non-standard configuration, and I'm working on fixing that right now. But really, I have a finished product. I have a fully operational car, seats two, goes about 45 miles an hour that I know of, and is fully functional. It's a lot of fun. It doesn't have power steering or brakes, so it's kind of a workout to drive, but it's a really rewarding experience to know that I did all that work and I have this fully functional vehicle. It's also been a great learning experience. I learned about each individual system from hydraulics with the brakes to electrical to the different battery systems and how electric propulsion works, and that's just been an incredible experience. So having learned all of this and had this experience, I realized that I've really gained as much as I'm going to from this, and I want to share this experience with others. So going forward in the future, I'm looking for a school, probably a less privileged school with low resources, that would like to establish some kind of STEM program. And I would like to donate this car and help them set up a program where they unbuild it and rebuild it each year so that more students can learn about hydraulics and electrical and the different electrical propulsion systems. I want to share the experience that I had. Now, when I give it to them, I'd like to give them possible extension projects. I've designed the hybridization system. Maybe they could implement that. I've designed a body panels and a roof and everything. Maybe they could implement that, or even more of an electric ecosystem like solar charging and maybe even lithium-ion batteries, more related to the electrical system. So I think that it's a great project. I learned a lot, and I think others will learn a lot, and there's potential for even expansion on that learning. I think it has a great future going forward, and I'd really like to see other people have the experience that I did. So that's kind of what I'll be working on next year. And I will be doing ISM next year, so you can look forward to another one of these presentations. I'm not really sure how I'm going to one-up this car project, but I think it should be a lot of fun, and I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. Really quick though, I want to thank a couple specific people. First of all, Dr. Grenade for this wonderful mentorship experience that I've had this whole year, all of his help and always being willing to help me with whatever I needed. Also, all of my coaches for being so flexible and letting me miss practice so many times. Y'all have been great. You're always very supportive of everything that I do, and I really do appreciate that. My teachers, I've missed a couple classes. Thankfully, I had an arrangement with Dr. Grenade where I didn't have to miss too much class, but I still want to thank them for being flexible when I did need to miss class. And then my parents, my mom for understanding all of the hours that I had to put into this, and my dad really for making this all happen. I really appreciate it, and without you, I couldn't have done any of it. So thank you to everyone. Thank you everyone for coming out tonight, and there's still some snacks left over, so have some of that. Thank you.